They said it so casually, as if tossing scraps to a dog. "You're not family, Martha. You never were." And then my suitcase, the one with the scuffed wheels and the faded tag from a trip I once took with my late husband, flew across the porch and landed on the lawn with a dull, humiliating thud that seemed to echo far louder than any scream I could have made. I remember the sound more than the words, the thick, wet heaviness of the grass after the sprinklers had run, the way the wheels sank slightly into the mud, as if even the earth understood I was being pushed out of somewhere I had helped build. I stood there holding the railing for balance, not because of my age, but because, in that moment, my body forgot how to carry itself without the weight of belonging. I was 78, but I wasn't fragile, not in the way they like to imagine. The fragile thing was the illusion that I still mattered to them, that all the years of sacrifice and patience and quiet presence had woven me into their home. I suppose I should have said something sharp, something that would have slid under their skin and stayed there, something my own mother might have whispered with her stern Irish resolve. But I didn't say anything. Words felt useless, like trying to stitch a torn sail in the middle of a hurricane. I just looked at my son's face, hoping to find a flicker of the boy who used to run to me when thunder shook the windows, who once asked if I could live forever because he didn't want a world without me in it. Instead, I saw the stiff, embarrassed expression of a man who had chosen comfort over conscience, and beside him, my daughter-in-law, Carla, with her arms crossed and her lips pressed into that thin, triumphant line she always wore whenever she thought she'd won something. It's strange. The things the mind clings to when it's being broken open. I didn't think about the years I'd worked overtime to help them buy this house, or the fact that part of its foundation, literally, had been paid with my savings. I didn't think about the nights I'd rocked their colicky baby until my back screamed, or the mornings I'd driven across town with casseroles because they were too tired to cook. No, what I thought about was the begonias, the ones blooming by the walkway. I had planted them the first summer after they moved in, digging my hands into the soil while Carla pretended not to notice. She'd laughed afterward and said they were old lady flowers. Too bright, too sentimental, not clean and modern like the rest of her curated world. But they had thrived, oblivious to judgment, spilling over the edges of the flower bed with stubborn joy. In that moment, as my suitcase lay at my feet, I thought how lucky those flowers were. They didn't need permission to stay. The neighbors pretended not to stare. That was the worst part. The quiet glances from across the street, the half-closed blinds, the polite little coughs of people who wanted to watch, but also wanted to be absolved of witnessing anything uncomfortable. I saw a woman walking her pug freeze in place as if pausing would make her invisible. I saw a man trimming his hedges turn his back, while still angling his head just enough to keep me in view. It wasn't cruelty. It was something colder. The need to separate themselves from the spectacle of someone else's shame. No one asked if I was all right. No one even waved. It was as if I'd already ceased to exist. Like the moment Carla declared I wasn't family, the whole neighborhood agreed to erase me for her convenience. I bent slowly, knees stiff but steady, and lifted my suitcase. Mud smeared across my fingers, and for a moment I stared at the stain like it was some kind of omen, a mark of exile. Carla stood above me on the porch, arms folded, chin high, the sun catching the diamonds in her ears. She looked like a queen surveying her conquered territory, my conquered territory. I had helped her son buy that porch. I had helped paint the railing. I had even chosen the housewarming wreath that hung behind her shoulder. But none of that mattered now. I could have reeled off every contribution, every kindness, every invisible hour I had poured into their lives, and it wouldn't have changed a thing. Some people don't see what's done for them unless it's wrapped in gratitude they can display to others. What I gave them wasn't for show, so it was easy to forget. My son didn't help me with the suitcase. He didn't come down the steps, or offer a hand, or say my name in that apologetic half-whisper children sometimes use when they've made a mistake. Instead, he looked at Carla, as if waiting for her nod of approval, and when she didn't give it, he looked away. I felt something loosen deep inside me, not like a crack, but like a knot untying, a slow, reluctant release of hopes I didn't realize I was still holding. I thought of the first time I swaddled him in a soft yellow blanket, the one I knitted while my belly was still round, dreaming of the mother I would be. I thought of the time he broke his arm at 8 years old and wouldn't let anyone but me help him into the car. I thought of the nights I stayed awake listening for his keys in the lock during his reckless teenage years. All of it seemed so tender and foolish now, memories belonging to a different lifetime, a different universe, one where my love had weight. The wind picked up, rustling the trees lining the yard, and a few leaves drifted down, spinning like tired dancers. I straightened my spine and let the breeze brush my face. It smelled like the start of autumn. Cooler days, longer shadows, the first hints of decay that always precede transformation. I gripped the handle of my suitcase and felt a steadiness settle into my bones. Not the steadiness of someone who still belonged, but the steadiness of someone who knew, finally, that she didn't have to. I walked down the driveway without looking back. That was important. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing regret in my eyes. I didn't want to carry the shape of their doorway inside me any longer. I heard Carla say something behind me, her voice thin and sharp, like the flick of a switchblade. But I didn't catch the words and didn't care to. I kept going, one step after another, feeling strangely tall for a woman my age, as if shedding their home also shed a weight I'd been hunched under for years. At the end of the street, I finally paused and turned my head. Not toward their house, but toward the horizon, toward the slow rise of the hill, the line of trees, the quiet that lay beyond the manicured perfection of that neighborhood. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to freedom stir inside me. Not joy, not yet, but the faint, tremoring promise of it. I didn't know then that life had its own cruel symmetry waiting for me, that 5 years from that exact day, I would stand again on that same lawn as its owner, watching Carla's face melt into disbelief the way sugar dissolves in boiling water. No, on that day, all I knew was the sound of my suitcase wheels scraping against the pavement, the beating of my heart in my ears, and the quiet certainty that a story I thought had ended was just beginning a darker, richer, stranger chapter. One I would one day tell, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of a woman who learned, far too late, that family is not defined by blood or history, but by who refuses to throw your life onto the lawn when it becomes inconvenient for them. I didn't understand the full weight of what they'd done until hours later, long after the shouting of the moment had faded, long after the last neighbor had retreated behind a sanitized facade of privacy. At first, I simply walked, more out of instinct than intention, dragging my suitcase behind me like an injured limb. The wheels scraped against the sidewalk in a rhythm that seemed to echo my heartbeat, steady but confused, as though my body was trying to keep pace with a truth my mind hadn't yet accepted. I kept expecting my son to call after me, to run down the driveway and say I'd misunderstood, that it had come out wrong, that Carla was stressed or tired or overwhelmed, and that of course I was still welcome. Of course I was still his mother. But the air behind me remained hollow and untouched, and the silence stretched so thin it felt like a thread pulled tight enough to snap. I walked toward the bus stop at the edge of the neighborhood because it was the only landmark I recognized, the only place that didn't belong to anyone who might judge me for standing there, suitcase in hand, looking like a woman who had tried to return to a life that no longer included her. The bench was cold when I sat down, the metal biting through my skirt, and for a moment I just stared at the row of houses across the street, perfect in their symmetry, each driveway framed by identical hedges trimmed into sterile shapes. It struck me then how unnatural that perfection was, how aggressively curated, and I realized I had never belonged among those artificial facades, no matter how many Sunday dinners I'd cooked or how many nights I'd spent babysitting their children so they could attend charity galas and networking events. I had been tolerated, not cherished, present, not wanted, useful, not valued. The bus arrived late, but I didn't board it. Instead, I sat there watching cars pass with the detached stillness of someone observing life from behind glass, as if everyone had been assigned a role in a play except for me. I don't know how much time passed before I finally remembered the envelope inside my purse, the one I had kept tucked beneath my wallet for years without really allowing myself to think about it. I had brought it only because habit long ago taught me to carry every important document whenever visiting my son. Not out of mistrust, but because Carla had developed a strange habit of accidentally misplacing things I needed. The thought of her hands rifling through my belongings again sent a slow, sour heat creeping up my chest. I opened my purse and slid the envelope out, my fingers shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the dull ache of inevitability. When I unfolded the packet, the crispness of the paper felt almost insulting, as if the clean edges mocked the mess that my life had become. I skimmed the lines I had read so many times before. My name, bold and unambiguous, listed first. My investment recorded in black ink. The legal affirmation that the house, their house, the one I had been thrown out of, was half mine. I remembered the day the papers were signed. I had baked a loaf of my late husband's favorite honey bread to celebrate, and Daniel had hugged me with the spontaneous joy of a child who'd just been given a key to the future. Carla had smiled her polite, brittle smile and said all the right words. But even then, something in her eyes warned me that gratitude was not a language she intended to speak fluently. I ignored it because that's what mothers do. Ignore the pricks of doubt, swallow the unease, and choose the version of reality that allows love to keep breathing. But sitting on that cold bus stop bench, the papers trembling slightly in my hands, I understood that love had been replaced long ago by convenience, by expectation, by the quiet entitlement that grows when generosity is treated as obligation. I remembered conversations over the years, little comments disguised as jokes. Mom, you're lucky we live close enough for you to help with the kids. Mom, you don't mind covering the groceries, right? Carla's parents did so much for us last month. Mom, don't wear that sweater tonight. It makes you look tired. I had smiled through all of it, believing it was normal, believing it was temporary, believing that my presence still carried some invisible but irreplaceable value. How naive that feels now, how painfully small. I thought about calling a taxi or checking into a hotel or walking into a cafe just to sit somewhere warm, somewhere anonymous. But instead, I stayed on that bench, as though leaving it would mean accepting everything that had happened, as though standing up would make the humiliation too real. The sun drifted lower, painting the pavement in long, soft shadows, and a breeze swept through the street, carrying the faint scent of rosemary from someone's garden. That smell, herbs warmed by late afternoon light, took me back to my old kitchen, to a time when my world was smaller but sturdier, anchored by routines and laughter, untainted by competition or status, or the fragile egos of people who valued appearances more than relationships. I felt something inside me tighten, and for a moment I was afraid I might cry. But the tears didn't come. Instead, a cold clarity settled in, slow and deliberate, like frost forming on a window. It was then that my phone buzzed in my pocket. For a split second, my heart lifted, foolishly hoping it might be Daniel. But when I glanced at the screen, it was a bank notification. Nothing more than an automated reminder that a small pension deposit had gone through. The indifference of it made me exhale a dry, humorless laugh. Even the universe seemed to be telling me, no one is coming to fix this for you. And maybe, for the first time in my life, I stopped waiting for someone to. I took a deep breath, long and steady, and the air felt heavy in my lungs, grounding, solid. I put the envelope back into my purse, zipped it shut, and stood up. My legs wobbled slightly at first, not from weakness, but from the sudden weight of a decision I didn't fully understand yet. All I knew in that moment was that I had been cast out from a place that was legally, emotionally, and historically half mine. And if they thought I would disappear quietly, the way unwanted things are swept into the trash, they didn't know me at all. I pulled my suitcase toward me and began walking again, not toward the house, but away from it, deeper into the city, where streetlights flickered on one by one and strangers passed by without measuring me against whatever cruel calculus families sometimes use to determine who is and isn't worth loving. I didn't know where I was going, not yet. But the air around me felt like the beginning of truth, and the quiet inside me felt like the opening of a door I hadn't dared touch in decades. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the shame and the anger and the hollow ache of being rejected by the very people I had built my life around, there was a small, steady pulse beginning to beat, soft, insistent, and undeniably alive. It was the pulse of change, the kind that tears your world apart but gives you yourself back in return. I did not expect the days after the humiliation on the lawn to unfold with such strange quietness, the kind that seeps into your bones before you even realize it has changed your temperature. And although I had walked away with my suitcase, and with some fragile, trembling sense of dignity still intact, I found myself slipping into a pattern of small, almost imperceptible diminishments that made the betrayal feel less like a shattering moment and more like a slow, deliberate sanding down of my personhood. It began with the calls that never came, the ones I kept pretending I wasn't waiting for, even as I turned the ringer up louder than usual, telling myself I was only doing it so I wouldn't miss a doctor's reminder or a pharmacy notification. But deep down, I knew I was listening for my son's voice and for some sign that he understood the cruelty of what had happened. And when the phone remained still and silent on the table, I told myself he was busy, tired, overwhelmed, anything other than indifferent. I went back to my small rented room across town, unpacked my clothes with mechanical movements, and washed my hands over and over, as if cleansing them of the mud from the lawn would somehow remove the memory of being told I wasn't family, yet even. After the water went cold, the words clung to me like a second skin. The next morning, I tried to resume my usual routines, walking to the market for bread and vegetables, greeting the shopkeepers with what I hoped looked like habitual calm. But there was something different in the way I moved, as if the world had tilted a few degrees overnight, and my steps were being pulled slightly toward one side by a weight I could not redistribute. I found myself checking my phone again, almost involuntarily, and when I finally received a message, it was not from Daniel, but from Carla. A short, clipped note that said simply, "We'll have someone drop off the few things you left behind. Please don't just show up. It's important for the kids that things stay stable." There was a strange hollowness in my chest as I stared at those words, a mixture of disbelief and resignation, because the things she considered mine were likely the least meaningful scraps: an old cardigan, a pair of slippers, maybe a book I'd forgotten beside the guest bed, while the real things, the invisible pieces of me woven through that house, the hours and years and sacrifices, were swept away without acknowledgement. I didn't respond. Responding would have made me complicit in the narrative she was building, the one where I was the problem, the source of instability, rather than a woman trying desperately to stand upright after being blindsided by the very people she had spent decades supporting. In the days that followed, I began to see the ways I had slowly been pushed out long before the suitcase hit the grass, as if the act itself had merely formalized a process that had been quietly unfolding beneath the surface of our interactions. Memories resurfaced with unsettling clarity. The time Carla had accidentally double-booked the guest room when her sister visited, and I had ended up sleeping on an air mattress in the basement. The birthday dinner where my seat at the table had been shifted to the far end near the sliding door for better air circulation, though everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable in the warm dining room. The subtle but unmistakable wince Daniel gave whenever I offered to bring a dish to a family gathering, as if my food might clash with whatever curated image Carla wanted to present to her friends. These weren't dramatic humiliations, and maybe that made them more dangerous, because I had dismissed them as oversights, misunderstandings, little bumps in the road of an otherwise functioning relationship. But now, with distance pressing against the edges of my vision, I saw them for what they were, a quiet campaign of erasure, one gentle stroke at a time. I noticed it too, in the way my son's voice sounded on the rare occasions he did call, not apologetic or remorseful, but cautious, measured, as though he feared stirring some beast within me, a beast he himself had created through his silence. He never mentioned the incident directly, never said he was sorry, never asked where I was staying or whether I needed anything. But he did ask if I was settling in well and whether I was managing okay. Phrases that floated in the air like politeness stripped of substance. And as he spoke, I could hear Carla in the background, her voice low and clipped, punctuating the silence in between his sentences, reminding him of what should and shouldn't be said. It became painfully clear that the woman who had married my son had been building her vision of a family for years, one where I was either a distant supporting character or not present at all, and Daniel, whether out of passivity or fear of conflict, had complied, adjusting himself to her narrative until he could no longer distinguish between her preferences and his own. One afternoon, a small box arrived on my doorstep, left by a courier who didn't ring the bell. Inside were the items Carla had mentioned: my slippers, an old paperback, a folded sweater with a faint scent of lavender detergent. And taped to the inside flap was a note written in her elegant looping handwriting. "Please do not return unannounced. It causes unnecessary tension." The casual cruelty of it stole my breath for a moment, not because it was harsh, but because of how frigidly polite it tried to be, as though she were offering me a favor by stating the terms of my exile. I sat at the kitchen table holding that note between my fingers, and for the first time since the day on the lawn, I felt something other than sorrow. It was not anger exactly, but a low, simmering heat, a quiet revolt beginning in the deepest part of me, the part I had ignored for too long. I folded the note carefully, placed it back in the box, and pushed it aside. As the days stretched on, I began waking earlier than usual, long before sunrise, sitting by the window watching the sky shift from blue-black to gray, and then finally to the soft warmth of morning. In those hours when the world was silent and unposed, I felt a strange kind of clarity seep into me, a recognition that what had happened was not a single event, but a culmination of years spent shrinking myself so that others could feel larger in their own lives. I had been disappearing piece by piece, and they had simply taken advantage of how easy it was to finish what I had already begun. That realization stung, but it also illuminated something important. If I had participated, even unconsciously, in my own erasure, then perhaps I could participate in my own reclaiming. I didn't know what that would look like yet. I didn't have a plan or a vision, or even the smallest hint of a path forward. But what I did have was time, space, and the first faint whispers of a spine straightening itself after being bent for far too long. And that, though I didn't yet understand it fully, was the beginning of something larger than pain, something that would eventually lead me back to the house I once helped buy, not as a guest or a burden, but as the rightful owner of the very ground from which I had been cast out. It was sometime in the third week after the incident on the lawn that the shift began, not with a dramatic moment or a sudden surge of courage, but with something quieter, more subtle. The way a season changes long before anyone notices the first. Leaf turning. I woke up one morning and realized I was tired of waiting, tired of checking my phone as if it were some kind of emotional lifeline, tired of shrinking into the corners of my own life just because the people who should have cherished me had found it convenient to pretend I wasn't there. I had spent my whole adulthood putting others first: my husband, my son, my grandchildren, even Carla, with her demanding ways and brittle politeness. And in that early light, while the world outside my rented room was still wrapped in a haze of pale blue dawn, something inside me whispered that I was allowed to want more than the quiet survival I had settled for. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the one comfortable chair by the window, watching the street slowly wake up, and it struck me that nothing was holding me in place except habit. It was a sobering realization, both humbling and strangely exhilarating, like looking down and discovering that the chains you thought were binding your ankles were nothing more than strands of old ribbon that had loosened on their own. Later that day, I went through my papers again, not because I expected anything new, but because I needed to see the truth in black ink rather than memory. The deed was still there, crisp and unforgiving, my name printed clearly beside my son's. I remembered the day we signed it, the pride in Daniel's voice when he called me the backbone of this family, a phrase that had sounded sweet at the time, but now felt like an accusation. I had supported them so completely that they no longer saw me as a person with my own needs and boundaries, only as a structure meant to hold up their lives. Holding that document, I realized something crucial. My contribution to that house was not sentimental or symbolic. It was financial, legal, and binding. They had not just rejected me emotionally. They had erased the very real part I played in creating the home they were so desperate to keep pristine and untouched by anything they didn't control. That understanding snapped something into focus, sharpening the edges of my awareness until everything felt startlingly clear. I went for a long walk afterward, letting my feet take me through unfamiliar streets lined with old trees, whose branches formed a canopy overhead, filtering the sunlight into soft, shifting patterns. With each, I wasn't abandoned. I had walked away from a place that had been turning colder for years, and I certainly wasn't dependent. I had built a life from the ground up long before my son had ever learned to tie his shoes. I found a small park and sat on a bench near a fountain, watching children run in circles while their parents chatted or scrolled through their phones. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around being someone's mother or grandmother or convenient emotional afterthought, a future that belonged solely to me. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked into a lawyer's office without calling ahead, without rehearsing my explanations, without minimizing what had happened. The receptionist looked up with mild surprise, but she was kind enough to listen when I said I needed to speak to someone about a property matter. They sent me to a young attorney whose suit was slightly too big and whose tie was crooked in a way that made me trust him more than someone polished to perfection. He listened as I explained the situation, his brow slowly knitting into a line of disbelief, and when I showed him the deed, he took a long, deliberate breath, the kind people take when they realize something is far more complicated than they assumed. He asked questions, not condescending ones, but practical, clarifying questions, and I answered them with a steadiness I didn't know I possessed. At the end of the meeting, he said, "You have more power in this situation than you think." And although I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time, I felt it land somewhere deep inside me, like a seed finding fertile soil. On the walk home, I realized I was standing straighter, my steps more sure, my breath less shallow. The world hadn't changed, but I had. Instead of feeling like an exile, I felt like a woman who had been nudged, violently and cruelly, toward rediscovering a self she had misplaced decades ago. It was not revenge that stirred in me, nor a desire to reclaim the house out of spite. It was something quieter, more profound, the need to reclaim myself, to stand firmly in the truth of what I had contributed, and to stop apologizing for existing in spaces I had helped build. That evening, I made a simple dinner and ate it slowly, savoring each bite as though it were the first meal of a new life. The room seemed warmer somehow, the air softer, the shadows less threatening. I sat by the window again, watching the streetlights flicker on, and I felt a peace I didn't recognize at first because it had been absent for so long. The shift wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. It moved through me like a tide turning in the dark, steady and unstoppable. For the first time since the day on the lawn, I wasn't waiting for a call that might never come. I wasn't longing for a past that had already let go of me. I wasn't shrinking to fit into a world that had no space for me. I was expanding, quietly, defiantly, and with a clarity that felt almost sacred. And though I didn't know it yet, that quiet shift, that small internal rearrangement, would become the axis on which my entire future would turn, guiding me toward the moment when I would stand on that same lawn again, not as a castaway, but as the rightful owner of everything they had taken for granted, including myself. I had thought that the quiet shift inside me, the first stirrings of resolve, would somehow insulate me from further harm, that once a woman begins to reclaim even a fragment of her own dignity, the world might grant her a brief mercy, a small pocket of stillness in which to breathe and realign herself. But life seems to have a peculiar fondness for testing the strength of a spine the moment it begins to straighten. And so the days following my meeting with the young lawyer did not soften, did not unfold gently, did not offer comfort. Instead, they began to press against me in new and unsettling ways, as though the past sensed that I was attempting to step out of its shadow and came charging forward, determined not to be forgotten. It started with a voicemail from Daniel, left at a time of day when he knew I wouldn't answer. His voice unusually clipped and businesslike, asking if we could clarify a few financial misunderstandings, a choice of words so painfully deliberate that I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck because Daniel had never spoken to me like a creditor or a client before. And the shift told me more than any apology ever could. He knew. He had gone through the paperwork I left behind, or perhaps Carla had, digging through every file I had once kept in the guest room drawer, and what they found there frightened them enough to warrant this sudden strategic politeness. I did not return the call, partly because I wasn't ready, and partly because I wanted to see how long it would take before concern turned into pressure. It didn't take long at all. The very next day, another message arrived, this time a text, though the phrasing was so stiff it might as well have been a letter dictated by someone who barely tolerated the idea of writing to me. Please contact us at your earliest convenience regarding property matters. It's important things remain amicable. Strange how people invoke amicable only when they fear the arrival of consequences, how they wrap their demands in the language of civility when they've long since abandoned civility in their behavior. I stared at the message for a long time before setting my phone face down on the table, feeling not angry, but exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing that people who once relied on your kindness are now scrambling to contain the fallout of their own ingratitude. Then Carla reached out. Not with her own voice, of course. She preferred to keep her hands clean. But through a mutual acquaintance, a woman I had met at one of their meticulously curated parties. A woman who always smiled too hard and too often, as if terrified of being caught without an expression of approval. She called out of the blue and attempted to wrap her intrusion in the gauze of small talk, asking how I was settling into my temporary arrangement, as if my living situation were a spontaneous inconvenience rather than the direct result of her friend throwing me out like an unwanted relic. After several minutes of meaningless chatter, she finally revealed the real purpose of her call. Carla's worried there might be confusion about the house documents. She says you may have misinterpreted some things. She wanted me to assure you that everything was sorted years ago. The words were delivered with that syrupy, patronizing tone reserved for elderly people who are expected to smile politely while being lied to. I thanked her for the call, though the sweetness of my voice surprised even me, and hung up before she could complete whatever script Carla had handed her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of tea that grew cold long before I touched it, replaying every small humiliation, every dismissive gesture, every time Carla had treated me as a placeholder rather than a person. The realization hit me with a force that made my breath catch. They weren't reaching out to mend anything. They were reaching out to contain me. They were afraid, not of me as their mother or mother-in-law, but of me as a co-owner, as a legal entity with rights, as someone who could disrupt the image of effortless success they had spent so long constructing. That fear was a strange sort of validation, though bittersweet, because it meant the door I had once believed shut forever had, in fact, been left slightly ajar, and I was finally aware enough to see it. Days later, an envelope arrived, hand-delivered, though the courier claimed he did not know who had sent it. Inside was a letter typed on expensive paper, bearing no signature, but full of phrases I recognized as Carla's. Miscommunication, potential complications, family harmony, essence of mutual respect, all wrapped around a subtle but unmistakable request that I sign a release acknowledging I had no present claim to the house. The audacity of it stunned me, not because they had asked, but because they believed I might agree. The letter implied concern for my well-being, hinted at age-related confusion, and suggested that maintaining the status quo would be in everyone's best interest. I laughed, a brittle sound that scraped against the quiet room, because suddenly everything was so transparent, so embarrassingly predictable, that I wondered how I had ever allowed myself to be deceived by the facade of family loyalty. I placed the letter on the table and stared at it for a long while, feeling something tighten in my chest, not fear, not sorrow, but a deep and unexpected clarity. I was beginning to understand what they had hoped, that I would retreat, fold into myself, convince myself I was overreacting, and relinquish what was rightfully mine, because the role of the quiet, compliant mother was the only one they had ever allowed me to play. But I was no longer willing to be small. I was no longer willing to cushion their misdeeds with silence. Getting older does not make one blind or fragile or complacent. Sometimes it makes one sharper, more attuned to the subtle shifts of power, less willing to tolerate the erosion of respect. When I returned to the lawyer's office with the letter, he read it slowly, his jaw tightening, line by line. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said finally, sliding the papers across the desk with the controlled movements of someone fighting the urge to crumple them outright. "Everything you've told me, everything in these documents, none of it suggests confusion on your part. It suggests the exact opposite." I felt a strange surge of warmth in my chest, the kind that comes from being seen with unflinching clarity, and I realized that this young man, barely older than my grandson, had offered me more respect in 1 hour than my own family had shown me in years. He explained my options carefully, making sure I understood every step. And for the first time since the day on the lawn, I felt not only protected, but empowered, as though I had been walking with a dim lantern, and someone had finally replaced it with a steady, bright flame. But escalation rarely unfolds neatly. As the legal processes began, slow, tedious, full of paperwork and verification, my phone filled with messages from Daniel, each one more frantic than the last. He accused me of betrayal, of creating chaos, of making life difficult for the children, as if I had not been the one who spent years anchoring their lives with unwavering devotion. He begged, then demanded, then attempted to guilt me, weaving narratives in which he was the victim and I was the unreasonable aggressor. There were nights when I sat awake staring at the screen, my heart aching at the sound of his voice unraveling in those long voicemails. Because despite everything, he was still my son. But with each message, I understood more clearly that loving him did not require surrendering myself. There is a point in every woman's life when she must choose between preserving peace for others and preserving dignity for herself, and I had finally, painfully chosen the latter. One evening, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights outside cast long, trembling shadows on my kitchen floor, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, his face pale, his eyes frantic, the facade of confident adulthood stripped away and replaced with something jagged and desperate. He didn't ask if he could come in. He pushed past me, pacing the room as if searching for something tangible to grab onto. He said the words I had always thought I wanted to hear. "I'm sorry." But they landed without weight, for they were followed immediately by, "But you're making things worse," which revealed the truth behind them. His apology was not born of remorse, but of fear. He tried to convince me that the legal steps I had taken were unnecessary, that he would fix everything if I just trusted him. But the trust he was asking for was no longer his to claim, and the fixes he promised were nothing more than attempts to lure me back into silence. It was in that moment, as he stood in my small kitchen with his voice trembling and his arguments unraveling, that I felt a second shift, sharper and deeper than the first. I realized that my son had grown accustomed to a version of me that no longer existed. He had built an entire worldview around a mother who absorbed pain like a sponge, who bent without breaking, who existed in the margins of her own life so others could fill the center. And now that I had stepped into the light, he didn't recognize me, didn't know how to speak to me, didn't know how to reconcile the woman before him with the shadow he had shaped in his mind. When he finally left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame, I stood alone in the quiet room, my breath unsteady, but my resolve unwavering. The escalation had taken shape fully now, undeniable and irreversible. They were fighting not for family unity, not for emotional reconciliation, but for control, image, stability on their terms. They wanted me back in the shadows, compliant and grateful, erased at their convenience. But I had stepped too far into myself to return to that place. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, something deep and unyielding, and as the days stretched forward, carrying me toward a future I could not yet envision, I felt the truth settle within me, like an anchor dropped into still water. I would not be. The day everything finally converged into one undeniable moment did not arrive with thunder or spectacle or any of the dramatic flourishes life sometimes uses to announce turning points. Instead, it slipped into place quietly, like a puzzle piece that had always been meant for the center, and I found myself moving through it with a clarity that felt both foreign and intimately familiar, as if some older version of myself had awakened from a long sleep and taken my hands in hers. The legal process had stretched on for months, each form, each signature, each meeting peeling away another layer of the emotional fog I had lived in for years. And as the case grew more solid, as the evidence accumulated, and the law turned its gaze toward the truth, the panic on the other side grew more obvious, not in angry outbursts anymore, but in brittle civility, carefully worded messages, forced invitations to sit down and talk like family, which only confirmed what I already knew. They felt the ground shifting beneath them. And yet, even with all that brewing, I did not fully understand how near the end was until the day the court rendered its decision, a ruling so unambiguous that even the lawyer, usually restrained behind his professional demeanor, allowed himself a brief moment of triumph as he slid the document across the table toward me. I stared at the paper, the words swimming slightly as tears rose, not those sharp, burning tears of grief, but the softer, heavier ones that come from relief so profound it almost aches. My name, written clearly, definitively, recognized by the state as a rightful owner, the primary owner, of the house from which I had been cast out with a suitcase and a handful of cruel words. It felt surreal at first, almost abstract, as though the life of the woman who had stood trembling on that lawn months earlier belonged to someone else, someone I might mourn, but no longer be. The lawyer explained the next steps, the logistics, the timeline, but I heard him only dimly, because the truth had already sunk in. I was going back, not as a guest, not as a supplicant, not as someone begging to be remembered, but as a woman, reclaiming what had been hers all along. The day I arrived at the house, the sky hung low with gray clouds that seemed ready to spill rain, and the air carried that heavy stillness that always precedes a storm. I drove myself, which was symbolic in ways I didn't allow myself to dwell on, and as I turned into the neighborhood, the manicured lawns and identical facades felt almost eerie, as though I were walking into a memory projected onto a fragile sheet of glass. Nothing looked changed, and yet everything was different, because I was no longer the same woman. I parked along the curb and sat still for a moment, both hands on the steering wheel, letting the weight of the moment settle into me with the slow certainty of truth finding its rightful place. When I stepped out of the car, the air was cool against my skin, and not a single neighbor pretended not to notice me this time. Curtains shifted, blinds tilted, eyes followed me in a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, and I walked up the driveway with a steadiness that made me feel taller than I had felt in years. The lawn was trimmed too short, as always, the walkway swept clean, the begonias long replaced by bland, ornamental grasses, and I felt a flicker of sadness at that, but it passed quickly. I rang the doorbell. There was a pause, long, stretched, filled with the frantic silence of people scrambling to understand what was happening, before the door opened and Carla appeared, her face drained of color, her lips parted slightly in an expression somewhere between outrage and dread. She didn't greet me. She didn't speak. She stood frozen, one hand on the doorframe as though bracing herself for impact. Behind her, I could see the living room with its immaculate furniture, the curated decor, the surfaces free of anything that hinted at real life. And for a moment, I wondered how much of her energy had gone into maintaining the illusion of control that was now crumbling around her. When she finally looked up at me, her voice cracked with something that almost resembled fear. "This is a mistake," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. Just then, Daniel appeared behind her, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition, to a kind of sorrow I had never seen in him before, not even during childhood injuries or the darkest days of his father's illness. He stepped forward, but he did not reach for me. Instead, he seemed to reach for some version of the past he could no longer retrieve. "Mom," he said quietly, and the single syllable trembled in the air, charged with regret and disbelief. I held his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I saw not the boy I had raised, nor the man I had tried to understand, but a stranger standing in the wreckage of his own choices. There was no anger left in me for him, only a distant sadness, the kind that settles like dust after a long, difficult storm. I stepped past them, not forcefully, but with the gentle assurance of someone who no longer needs permission to exist. And with each footstep, I felt the rooms reclaim themselves, as though the house had been waiting, patiently, for the return of someone who had once breathed life into its walls. I walked through the kitchen, remembering the meals I had cooked there, the nights I had washed dishes alone while the others chatted in the living room, the mornings when I had stood by the window slicing fruit for breakfast, only to be told later that it didn't fit the aesthetic. I touched the edge of the counter, not nostalgically, but in acknowledgement, like greeting an old friend who had survived the years in quiet solidarity. Carla followed me, her words tumbling out in frantic fragments, claims of misunderstanding, attempts at justification, sudden swings from anger to pleading, but I listened with a calm that surprised even me. There is a certain power that comes when a woman stops negotiating her worth, when she no longer absorbs blame for the comfort of others, and in that moment nothing she said could rattle me. Daniel remained near the doorway, shoulders slumped, the weight of consequences settling onto him with stark clarity, and I wondered whether he finally understood that the cost of silence can be higher than any conflict one tries to avoid. Eventually, I stepped back outside, not because I doubted my place in the house, but because I wanted the final moment to happen where it had all begun, on the lawn. The clouds had darkened, the wind rising with a low murmur, and the air smelled of coming rain. Carla followed, her voice thin and trembling, and as she stepped onto the grass, I turned and faced her fully for the first time. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in that way people shrink when stripped of the illusions that made them feel powerful. The wind tugged at her hair, scattering it across her face, and in her eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear, yes, but beneath it, the faintest flicker of recognition, as though she finally saw me not as a burden, but as a woman who had survived, more than she had ever bothered to know. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech. I simply said, with steady quietness, the words that had lived inside me since the day she threw my suitcase into the grass. You should collect your things from the property as soon as possible, and please don't leave anything on the lawn. I prefer to keep it clean. The irony was not lost on either of us, and for a moment the wind carried the weight of what had passed between us, of what had been taken and what had been returned. When I walked back to my car, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and cool against my skin, and though the storm gathered strength behind me, I felt only stillness inside, the deep and steady kind that comes when a long-delayed truth finally settles into place. I had not reclaimed the house to punish them, nor to prove anything, nor to gloat. I had reclaimed it because it had been mine, because I had earned it, because I had spent too many years standing outside the life I had built with my own hands. And as I drove away, the road darkened by rain, I realized that the real victory was not in the property or the legal documents, but in the quiet certainty blooming inside me. The certainty that I would never again allow anyone to decide what I was worth. Not even the people I once loved more than life itself. I did not move into the house right away, even after the dust of paperwork settled and the keys lay cool and certain in my palm. For a few weeks, I came only in small, measured visits, like someone visiting a relative at a hospital, checking on the rooms to see which ones were still breathing and which ones had gone quiet. And in that slow, deliberate pacing through the familiar spaces, I gave myself time to understand that this was not a temporary arrangement or a generous loan of mercy from the world, but something permanent, something I had chosen and had, in a way, earned twice over. First with money, and second with the long, painful work of finally choosing myself. The first morning I spent there alone, without boxes, without obligations. I brewed coffee in a simple old pot I brought from my rental, and sat at the kitchen table with the window cracked open. The house felt different, stripped of their noise, lighter somehow, without the constant strain of performance it used to carry. And as the breeze slipped through the screen and stirred the edges of a forgotten grocery list still magneted to the fridge, I realized that the walls did not remember. Cruelty, only contact, and my hands could teach them something kinder now. I walked barefoot through the living room and opened the curtains wide, letting light flood the corners where shadows had once been carefully curated. And when the sun hit the floorboards just so, I remembered painting those walls years ago. Brush in, hand, sweat on my neck, laughing with a Daniel who still knew how to be grateful, and the memory no longer stabbed me. It settled beside me like an old photograph. True, but no longer alive. The neighbors adjusted slowly, the way people do when the story they told themselves about a person stops fitting neatly into the space they assigned her. At first, they watched from a distance, their gazes skimming past me as if afraid that direct eye contact might draw them into some uncomfortable responsibility. But eventually, one of them, the woman with the pug who had frozen that day, my suitcase hit the lawn, crossed the street with a hesitant wave and a plate of brownies that were slightly overbaked at the edges. She did not apologize for anything specifically. People rarely do when their sin is silence. But she did say, with a kind of awkward sincerity, that it was nice to see me back. And though the words were small, they landed gently enough that I chose to accept them as a beginning rather than an indictment of what she might have done differently. I was too tired for grudges and too old to carry them without them carving into my shoulders, so I let them fall where they wanted and decided to fill my days with other things, rearranging furniture to suit my taste instead of someone else's aesthetic, replanting the front flower bed with sturdy, unapologetic blooms that did not know the word embarrassing, and claiming little rituals that belonged to no one but me, like sitting on the back steps at dusk with a cup of tea and naming the colors in the sky as they faded one into another. It was Kieran who bridged the gap between what had been and what now was, not with grand gestures, but with steady presence. He came alone, as I had once asked in a letter I never sent, and he somehow understood anyway. And when I opened the door to him for the first time in this new version of my life, he stood on the porch, looking older, his shoulders broader, his eyes carrying the tiredness of someone who had watched his parents' version of events unravel and decided not to believe all of it. We did not talk much that first afternoon. We walked through the rooms together, in a quiet that felt reverent, his fingers brushing the edges of shelves that used to hold his childhood toys, my voice offering small stories only when he asked, and as we reached the back door and stepped out into the yard, he looked at the freshly planted flowers and said softly that he remembered the begonias, the ones everyone used to pretend were too bright, but always seemed to make him happy because they looked like little pieces of candy stuck in the dirt. I laughed, a warm, full sound that surprised me with its ease, and told him that perhaps this time we'd grow something that did not need anyone's approval to exist. When he left later that evening, he hugged me with the unstudied tenderness of a boy who had finally stopped apologizing for loving the wrong person too much. And I felt something in my chest loosen, not the past, which would always be the past, but the fear that it would forever be the only thing between us. As weeks turned into months, the house shed its old skin slowly. I donated the furniture that was chosen for magazines rather than comfort, removed the meaningless abstract art that never spoke to me, and filled the shelves with books that smelled faintly of dust and stories. The kind of company that never asks you to be prettier or smaller or quieter. I cooked for myself in the evenings, not elaborate dishes meant to impress a table full of people who barely tasted them, but simple meals I ate hot and at my own pace. And I played music sometimes, soft jazz, old ballads, the occasional silly pop song, letting it bounce off the walls in waves that felt like reclaiming space I had once shrunk away from. There were lonely moments, of course, hours when the silence wrapped itself around me a little too tightly, and my mind wandered to the what-ifs and almosts. But those moments did not own me anymore. I would let them pass through and then redirect myself gently toward the things that were real. The feel of warm dishwater on my hands, the sound of a bird tapping at the window, the satisfaction of choosing a new curtain rod because I liked it, not because it matched a catalog page. Daniel wrote once, a long email that read more like a monologue performed to an invisible jury than a message to his mother. He spoke of stress and pressure and misunderstandings, of how he had been caught between loyalties, and as I read his words, I felt neither the urge to forgive nor the urge to strike back, only a quiet certainty that our relationship now lived on the far side of a line he had crossed with his own 2 feet. I thanked him for writing and said simply that I wished him peace, that I hoped he would one day learn the difference between keeping the peace and keeping people small, and that my door would not be open to further discussions about the past, because I was busy living whatever years I had left in the present. It was not a punishment, it was a boundary, and boundaries, I had learned, are not walls built against love, but fences that protect whatever fragile new growth is trying to take root in your soul. Sometimes, when the evening light hits the front steps just right, I stand where I once stood with my suitcase at my feet and the taste of rejection cold and metallic on my tongue. And I look out over the lawn that now belongs to me in every sense that matters. I think about the woman I was that day, tired, bewildered, still bargaining with a kind of love that had stopped including her. And I want to reach through time and tell her that being pushed out was not the end, that it was a violent, painful form of release, that the world beyond that gate held not only loneliness, but also a freedom she had never been allowed to imagine. I cannot go back for her, but I can honor her by refusing to forget what it cost her to walk away. And if another woman, somewhere, finds herself on a lawn with her life at her feet and someone telling her she is not family, I hope she remembers this much. Houses can change hands, names can be struck from documents and written back in bank. Accounts can empty and refill, but the most important title you will ever claim is the one no court can give or take. Owner of your own life, steward of your own heart. If that moment ever finds you, don't wait for someone to come out and call you back inside. Pick up your suitcase, stand tall, and walk toward whatever horizon opens, even if your knees shake. One day, you may find yourself exactly where you were meant to be all along, sitting at a kitchen table in a home that finally feels like yours, looking back not with bitterness, but with a kind of fierce, quiet pride that says, "They did not save me. They released me, and I at last saved myself."